It was April 1945, somewhere between Okinawa and the dark edge of the Pacific. The war was gasping toward its violent end, and the sea carried the sound of surrender like a rumor no one wanted to believe. Below deck, 100 Japanese women sat pressed shoulder to shoulder in the steel belly of a transport ship. The air was thick with diesel and salt. Every breath tasted of rust. Among them was a young nurse, only 22, her hair crudely shorn, her uniform hanging loose from weeks of hunger. She had once believed she would die on the battlefield, loyal to the Emperor. Instead, she was here, alive, captured and nameless. A ghost between worlds. They called it repatriation. The women called it shame. Each had been pulled from the chaos of collapsing field hospitals, taken from the wounded they could not save, from cities they no longer recognized. The ship creaked and rolled under a pitiless sun. No one spoke loudly. The language of fear was quieter. A glance, a tremor, a prayer whispered into metal walls. They were told that captivity was worse than death, that the Americans would strip them of honor, that they would never see Japan again. In the silence, imagination became its own torture. Days blurred into one another. The guards above spoke in rough English, their words sharp and strange. Buckets of thin soup were lowered down once a day, and each woman cupped her hands like a beggar. The nurse tried not to think of home, but memory was cruel. She saw her mother kneeling in the garden, her brother in his school uniform, the smell of the sea near Yokohama before the air raids turned it to smoke. Every wave that struck the hull felt like the heartbeat of a dying world. When land finally appeared, the women expected the gates of hell. Instead, the ship docked in silence. They were herded onto a train that hissed like a living creature. Through the grimy windows, America unfolded. Not the monster they had imagined, but a vast and careless beauty. Green fields rolled past. Windmills spun lazily. Boys rode bicycles beside the tracks, waving as though at tourists. The prisoners could not wave back. Some cried softly, not from fear this time, but confusion. The world looked untouched. How could such a place exist while their cities burned? The journey inland stretched for days. Every stop brought whispers. Would they be executed here, displayed in cages? No one knew. The nurse held her breath each time the brakes screeched. When at last the train halted, the sign outside read Camp Wayrite. The letters meant nothing, but the word camp chilled her. The guards ordered them onto buses. They obeyed, too tired to resist, too lost to hope. As the convoy rolled across the Texas plains, the nurse stared out the window. The sky was enormous, a blue she had never seen before. It made her feel smaller than she had on any battlefield. A child beside her clutched a photograph of a baby wrapped in cloth, her son, born before the fall of Okinawa. She whispered prayers in a trembling voice. The guard sitting across the aisle did not stop her. He only watched with a face that looked almost human. When the buses finally stopped, the women braced themselves for barking dogs, whips, humiliation, but none came. The camp that awaited them looked more like a strange little village than a prison. Wooden barracks lined in neat rows, white fences, a mess hall with smoke curling from its chimney. There were towers at the corners, yes, and guards with rifles, but no shouting, only the hum of engines and the soft rattle of keys. Inside the processing hall, they were handed canvas bags, towels, soap, and plain cotton dresses. The nurse hesitated when told to undress. Her hands shook. She waited for the slap, the insult, the sneer. It never came. The American woman behind the table looked at her, not with pity, not with hatred, just with something she couldn't name. Perhaps routine, perhaps mercy. The showers hissed to life. The nurse stepped, under the water, cold and clean, and wept quietly. The dirt of months ran down her legs like old sorrow. No one mocked her. For the first time in years, no one shouted. That night, the barracks were still. The air smelled faintly of soap and starch. The nurse lay awake on her bunk, staring at the knot in the wood above her. The silence was unbearable. She had been prepared for cruelty, not for peace. It was too gentle, too strange. Outside, crickets sang in the dark, and the electric lights glowed softly along the fence. She whispered into the night, "What if we are not here to be punished? What if we are simply here?" The thought itself felt like treason, But even as she said it, another voice inside her whispered that nothing could be trusted, not the silence, not the soft beds, not the smell of clean linen. She closed her eyes and clutched the thin blanket, wondering which would break first, the walls around them, or the walls inside them. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote howled, and she felt the sound pass through her like a memory of freedom she had forgotten she once had. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the slats of the barracks. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang. The women stirred, blinking into the pale dawn. The war was still raging across oceans, but here, in this unlikely corner of Texas, time seemed to have stopped. The nurse sat up slowly, listening. There was no shouting, no boots pounding the ground. Only one sound reached her, faint, sweet, and impossible. It was the smell of coffee. The morning light stretched across the Texas horizon, gold and unhurried. It crept through the cracks of the wooden barracks, landing on the faces of women who had forgotten what peace looked like. The bell rang again, a soft metallic chime that sounded more like a school summons than a command. The nurse sat up, heart pounding, her thin blanket clutched against her chest. Around her, others did the same, whispering questions they couldn't answer. The air was warm, filled with something unfamiliar, the smell of roasted grain and salt. Then she realized it was coffee, real coffee, carried on the breeze like a message from another world. They stepped outside in small, uncertain groups. No one shouted orders, no guard struck them with a rifle butt. Instead, a man at the door pointed toward a long building where voices murmured. The nurse followed the line of women, the gravel crunching under their bare feet. Her body trembled, not from cold but disbelief. Inside the mess hall, sunlight spilled across metal trays and steam rose from vats of stew. The noise was gentle, civilized, the scrape of ladles, the hiss of coffee poured into tin mugs. The young soldier behind the counter smiled awkwardly and filled her bowl. She blinked at the food as if it were a hallucination. Chunks of beef floated in a thick broth, potatoes soft and glistening, bread so white it seemed impossible. She stared at the tray for a long moment before sitting down at a wooden table. The others hesitated too. One woman whispered that it might be poison, another prayed under her breath. Then, slowly, someone took a bite. Silence held for one heartbeat, then two, and then a soft sound. A sigh, a swallow, a quiet sob. The nurse lifted her spoon. The taste was staggering. The meat was tender, the broth rich and warm against her throat. It was nourishment, real and undeserved. Her stomach clenched in shock. For months she had eaten boiled weeds and scraps of rice. Now she was tasting kindness, and it frightened her. Across the table, a woman from Nagasaki bit into a soft roll and began to cry openly. The nurse wanted to stop her, to tell her not to show weakness, but she couldn't speak. Her own tears burned behind her eyes. Around them, guards stood quietly, watching but not interfering. The young soldier from before, the one with freckles and a nervous half-smile, set down a tray near the end of the table and muttered, "Eat while it's hot." The words were ordinary, but the tone was not. It carried no threat, only sincerity. The nurse didn't know what to do with sincerity. It was heavier than cruelty. Later that morning they were given small brown packets. Inside was something sticky and golden. Peanut butter, one of the translators called it. The women sniffed it cautiously. Some recoiled, others dared to taste. The first woman to try it gagged, then laughed, the sound startling in its brightness. A few joined her. No one was punished. The laughter echoed through the hall like wind through an open window. It felt forbidden and holy. The nurse pressed a bit of the strange paste to her tongue and found it sweet, absurdly sweet. She laughed too, softly, covering her mouth. It was the first real sound of joy she had made since the bombs fell over Okinawa. That night, when they returned to their bunks, the nurse lay awake and listened to the quiet. The barracks smelled faintly of soap and wood. She could hear breathing, slow and even, a rhythm she hadn't known since childhood. Somewhere outside, a guard was whistling, off-key but gentle. She didn't understand this world. It was too calm, too clean. It unnerved her more than any battlefield, because if captivity could look like this, then what else might be untrue? Could the enemy have mercy? Could the world still hold grace in the middle of ruin? Days passed, measured not by hunger or pain, but by routine. Each morning the bell rang. Each night the crickets sang. The women began to move slower, less afraid of shadows. Some even talked to the guards through the translator, asking small questions. How far is the ocean? How long until we go home? The answers were vague, but the tone was patient. The young nurse began to memorize the camp. The shape of the barracks, the stretch of barbed wire glinting under the sun, the way dust swirled when trucks passed by. There were towers at the corners, but even they seemed lazy, like props in a forgotten play. The Americans stood inside them smoking. Not watching closely, not cruelly, just existing. It was disorienting to be treated as something less than hated. Then one evening something shifted again. The sunset turned the fence wires gold, and a guard walked past humming a tune the nurse didn't know. The melody was slow, almost sad. For a moment she wanted to ask what it meant, but the words froze in her throat. Instead she watched him disappear beyond the corner tower. She looked down at her hands, clean now, her nails trimmed. The sight filled her with guilt. She thought of her comrades back home starving, dying with honor, while she sat here in a camp eating stew and washing her hair. The kindness felt like a betrayal. Every act of mercy made her loyalty ache. That night she couldn't sleep. The moonlight fell across the wooden floor, tracing patterns like veins. The silence pressed in until she whispered into it, "If they treat us like humans, are we still prisoners?" Her voice cracked on the last word. She wanted someone to answer, but only the night replied, a soft hum of insects and wind. Somewhere far away, a train whistled across the plains, and for the first time she realized she was no longer afraid of the sound. It didn't mean transport. It meant distance. Distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. The next morning, when the bell rang again, she rose without waiting for orders. Her reflection in the cracked mirror startled her. There was color in her cheeks, light in her eyes. The sun had risen high over the Texas plains, turning the barbed wire fences into ribbons of light. The nurse stood in line outside the mess hall, her bare feet coated with dust, her heart beating too quickly for a morning so still. The scent of cooked meat drifted through the air again, heavy and rich. It felt wrong for something to smell so good in a place meant for punishment. The bell rang twice. Metal trays clattered against each other. The women ahead of her moved slowly, their eyes darting like birds. Fear had not left them. It had simply learned to whisper instead of shout. Inside, the mess hall buzzed softly with motion. The air was thick with steam and warmth, and along the counter stood young soldiers ladling stew into bowls. The nurse clutched her tray with trembling hands. When her turn came, the boy behind the counter smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything. "Morning," he said, his accent strange but gentle. He poured a scoop of stew, dropped a slice of buttered bread beside it, and filled a mug with dark coffee. She nodded without understanding a word and moved on. It wasn't just food, it was ceremony. She had survived on scraps, on silence, on the taste of loss. Now she was being asked to eat like she mattered. At the tables the women sat in rows, motionless. Steam curled above their trays like ghosts escaping from another world. Someone whispered that it was a trick, that the kindness would vanish once they let their guard down. Another whispered that the coffee must be drugged. The nurse stared at her spoon, her mind screaming at her to wait. Then the woman across from her, the one who always hummed prayers before sleeping, lifted her spoon and tasted the stew. Nothing happened. No laughter from the guards, no punishment. Only a quiet sigh and a single tear slipping down her cheek. That was enough. The nurse followed. The flavor struck like lightning. The broth was thick and alive with salt and fat. The meat melted on her tongue. Her hands shook as she took another bite. Every nerve in her body screamed to stop, to remember who she was, but her stomach overruled her pride. The bread broke apart softly between her fingers. The butter left a film on her lips. She had never tasted shame and comfort in the same mouthful before. It undid her. Around her, others began to eat too, some in silence, others in disbelief. One woman laughed suddenly, a sharp, almost hysterical sound that made everyone freeze. Then she laughed again, covering her mouth. The sound was contagious. Within moments, laughter filled the hall, thin, uncertain, but alive. The guards did not interfere. One leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching with something like pity. The young soldier from the counter smiled as if embarrassed by their joy. It wasn't triumph he saw. It was the quiet resurrection of hunger. The nurse looked around the room and felt her throat tighten. These women had been ghosts. Now, for the first time in months, they were breathing. Later that day, a translator passed through the barracks handing out small rations. Each woman received a brown paper packet with strange writing on it. The nurse tore hers open and frowned. Inside was a pale paste that smelled of sweetness. "Peanut butter," the translator said. "American food." The women sniffed it suspiciously. One dipped her finger and gagged. Another tried and laughed at the stickiness. Soon the barracks echoed with giggles as they traded tastes, faces scrunched in disgust and delight. The nurse touched a bit to her tongue and felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. The sweetness made her dizzy. She hadn't realized how much she had forgotten the taste of pleasure. That night, she wrote her first words in English, copied from a small phrase book another prisoner had found. "Thank you." She traced the letters over and over in the margin of her notebook until they looked like prayer marks. The words felt heavy and dangerous. Gratitude toward an enemy was a forbidden thing. But as she lay in bed, full for the first time in memory, she whispered them into the dark. "Thank you." The syllables felt fragile, but they stayed on her lips until sleep came. Days passed in quiet rhythm. The food continued. Beans, rice, warm bread, and coffee that smelled like courage. The nurse began to recognize faces among the guards. One had a scar on his cheek and always carried 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one he placed on the end of their table without a word. Another played with a harmonica during break, soft tunes that carried through the camp like distant lullabies. The line between enemy and captor grew thinner with every shared moment. But with comfort came guilt. Some of the women began refusing food again, unable to bear the thought of eating while Japan burned. One, a typist from Osaka, folded her bread carefully each morning and hid it under her pillow. "For when I'm starving again," she said quietly. The nurse didn't argue. She understood too well. Each act of kindness twisted against the lessons they had been raised on. The empire had promised them honor through suffering. Yet here, honor seemed replaced by something gentler, survival. One evening, as the sun fell red across the prairie, the nurse stood near the fence watching smoke rise from the guard's fire. It carried the scent of roasted corn and grilled meat. The air shimmered with heat. She could see them laughing, passing plates, their silhouettes golden in the dying light. The smell reached her, sharp and sweet. Her stomach tightened. She turned away, ashamed of her longing. Yet as she walked back to the barracks, the smell followed her, lingering like a memory she had never lived. That night, lying in bed, she understood something she couldn't yet name. Hunger wasn't only for food, it was for meaning, for mercy, for the small, stubborn proof that life could exist even here, beyond defeat. By late afternoon, the wind shifted, and with it came a smell the prisoners could not name without trembling. Smoke drifted over the fence, warm and sweet, threaded with fat and wood. The women lifted their faces like travelers scenting rain. Some pressed hands to their throats. Others looked at the guards as if the air itself were a trick. The nurse stood among them, heart thudding, stomach tightening against old discipline. She had learned to distrust the senses. Now the senses were calling her back to life. A translator arrived with 2 soldiers and a clipboard. He cleared his throat and spoke carefully. Local ranchers and camp staff would be hosting a cookout just outside the wire. Attendance was voluntary. No speeches, food and shade. The words dropped into the quiet like pebbles into a well, voluntary. The idea itself wobbled like a newborn fawn. One woman hissed that they were not dogs to be fed for show. Another whispered that to refuse would be wiser. The nurse could not move at all. The gate stood open. The sun burned low. Somewhere beyond the fence, someone laughed, and the sound did not sound like victory. It sounded like summer. They walked out in a thin line, each step a dare to fate. No rifles were raised, no orders barked. Beneath a wide cottonwood, long tables sat dressed in red and white cloth. Iron grills popped and hissed. Cowboy hats tilted like sails against the light. A tall man with sunburned cheeks held a platter and said, almost shyly, "Evening, ladies." The nurse flinched at the word, ladies. She had not been addressed as anything but prisoner since capture. Her pulse stuttered. If kindness was a weapon, it was the most disarming she had ever faced. Plates were pressed into their hands. The meat was dark at the edges and shining at the center. There were buns stacked high as pillows, bowls of beans studded with onion, jars of a red sauce bright as lacquer. Someone murmured the word ketchup, as if naming a comet. The nurse stared at her. Plate, unsure how to hold it. Her hands remembered bandages, stretchers, the weight of a dying man's wrist. They did not remember picnic china. She stepped to the edge of a table and sat. Across from her, a woman from Nagano folded her napkin twice as if it might fly away. The cowboy with the platter stopped beside them and poured tea into paper cups. "Hope you are hungry," he said, and the translator repeated it. The nurse lifted the bun. Heat met her palms. She felt tears rising for no reason she could explain. Then she took a bite. Char and sweetness, smoke and spice, salt and flame. It rushed over her like a wave and left her breathless. She had expected poison or pity. She had not expected joy. Her throat tightened. She chewed anyway. The second bite was braver. The third was gratitude she could not name. Around her, suspicion softened by degrees. A guard rolled up his sleeve to reach for a pitcher, and a wedding band caught the light. The nurse stared at the small ring as if it were an artifact from a forbidden temple. A wife waiting, perhaps a child. The image cracked the mask she had placed on every American face. They were not myths. They were people tied to kitchens and small rooms and someone's evening prayer. She looked away quickly, as if the truth itself might burn. Laughter rose near the grills. Two men were arguing with mock solemnity about whose sauce was better, Texas or Carolina. The translator tried to keep up and failed, and this failure made one of the prisoners laugh, a small, honest sound. No one punished her for it. Another woman reached for the ketchup and passed it down the line like contraband. The nurse watched the bottle travel hand to hand, and something inside her eased. The war had taught her to count rations and seconds and breaths. Here, for a moment, she counted nothing. When the music started, it was not from a radio, but from a harmonica pulled from a guard's pocket. The tune bent in the warm air, simple and old. The women looked up, as if a bird had flown into the room of the world. One of them hummed along without meaning to. The guard with the harmonica added another bar, and the cowboy tapped his boot in dust. The nurse felt the beat in her ribs. She had forgotten the body could keep time with anything but fear. Then Natsuko, the schoolteacher whose hands always shook during roll call, stepped forward. She did not speak. She simply set her plate down and reached for a pair of tongs. The cowboy paused mid-flip. "You want to help?" he asked. The translator relayed the question, but Natsuko had already nodded. A silence fell that was not tense so much as waiting. The cowboy stepped aside. Natsuko turned the meat, and the grill answered with a hiss. The sound was ordinary. The moment was not. The nurse felt it pass through the crowd like a current, participation, not compliance, not surrender, something else. The line between captor and captive blurred, not erased but smudged by heat and grease and breath. The nurse took a sip of tea and watched the sky deepen. Shadows stretched toward the fence as if to measure it for burial. From the corner of her eye she saw a guard bend to pick up a photograph that had fallen from a prisoner's pocket. He handed it back without a word. She caught the motion of his lips. The shape looked like sorry. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the light lied. But even doubt tasted different now, less bitter, more human. A child's memory rose in her unbidden. Her mother's summer kitchen, eel over coals, laughter from the alley. The smell was not the same, but the feeling was. The nurse set her fork down and pressed a hand to her chest. How could that tenderness survive here, under a foreign sky, inside a fence built to hold her fast? The question startled her so much she almost stood. She did not move. The wind cooled, and petals from the cottonwood drifted over the table like slow snow. When the plates were scraped clean, no signal called the evening to a close. People began to linger as if the day had decided to stay a little longer. The nurse wiped sauce from her fingers with a cloth she would later fold and hide in her trunk. Across the table, the woman from Nagano whispered that her son used to ask for red sauce. She had not spoken of him since capture. The words shivered out and hung between them like a bridge. The nurse thanked the cowboy in a voice that broke on the first syllable. He shrugged as if embarrassed and tipped his hat to the translator. The gesture was too gentle to fit in any story she had been told. She tucked it away like contraband, something to smuggle past the guards of her own mind. As dusk thinned into night, the guards carried lanterns that bobbed like small moons. The prisoners rose in small groups. No one pushed them toward the gate. They chose their moment to return to the barracks, carrying paper plates and quiet shocks inside their ribs. The nurse walked last, turning once to see the embers banked in the grills, red as watchful eyes. She could smell the smoke on her hair. It would cling for days. She hoped it would. She feared it would. Back in her bunk, she lay awake and listened to the camp exhale. Someone whispered the word neighbors. Someone else hissed silence, but without anger. The nurse traced the ceiling beam with her gaze until the room blurred. A question throbbed behind her eyes. If kindness tasted better than victory, what was she supposed to do with the hunger it left behind? She closed her eyes and saw Natsuko at the grill, turning the meat with steady hands. The image held. It would not fade. The boundaries of the old world were still there, barbed and bright, yet within them a door had opened. She did not know where it led. She only knew she had stepped toward it when she accepted a plate, when she swallowed fire and sweetness and did not choke. Outside, a coyote called to the dark. The nurse listened until her breath matched the slow rhythm of the night. The announcement came on a morning painted in pale gold. The camp was quiet except for the distant hum of insects. A translator appeared at the door of the barracks, holding a clipboard close to his chest, flanked by 2 guards. He cleared his throat and spoke softly, his tone careful, almost apologetic. The women would be allowed to write letters home. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Letters, home. It was like being told they could breathe water. The nurse sat frozen, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Then, one by one, small stacks of paper and sharpened pencils were passed down the rows of bunks. The paper looked impossibly white, fragile as skin. Some women refused to touch it. Others held it close, as though afraid it might vanish. The nurse took hers last. She placed the single sheet on her lap, staring at the empty space that waited for her voice. What could she say? That she was alive? That she was fed by the enemy? That she no longer recognized the woman she had been when captured? The pencil felt heavier than any weapon she had ever handled. Around her, whispers rose like wind through tall grass. A woman from Sapporo clutched her paper to her chest and wept silently. Another muttered that it was a trap, that anything written would be used against them. The translator said nothing. He only waited. The nurse looked down again and began to write slowly, her handwriting neat, the strokes trembling. "Mother, I am alive." The words startled her. She almost erased them. They were too bold, too real. She hesitated, then continued. "I eat rice and meat. The guards are not cruel. We sleep in clean beds. I do not understand this place." She stopped again, staring at what she had written. It felt like betrayal. The Empire had told them that Americans were monsters, but monsters did not hand out soap and coffee. Monsters did not call you miss or play harmonica under the stars. At the far end of the barracks, one woman folded her letter before finishing a single line. "I can't," she whispered. Another prayed over hers as if performing a funeral rite. The nurse wanted to tell them it was safe, but she couldn't be sure. Nothing here felt real enough to trust. The translator collected the finished letters in a bundle. The nurse hesitated, her thumb smudging the corner of the page, then placed hers on the pile. Days passed. No one mentioned the letters again. The camp moved on as if the words had never left their hands. Then, weeks later, a rumor spread like fire through the bunks. The Red Cross had confirmed it. The letters had reached Japan. Copies had been reviewed, censored, and forwarded. Families were reading them. Mothers knew their daughters were alive. Husbands had wept at the mention of soap and clean blankets. The nurse sat on her bunk, stunned. She imagined her mother opening the envelope with trembling fingers, her father perhaps hiding his tears behind a newspaper. What would they think of her words? Would they believe her, or would they call her broken, dishonored by comfort? The thought tore at her. She wanted them to know she was safe, but not at the cost of their faith. Could kindness be shameful? Could mercy be dangerous? That night, a storm rolled across the plains. Lightning flashed over the wire fences, turning them white as bone. The rain drummed against the barracks roof in a relentless rhythm. The nurse couldn't sleep. She listened to the others breathing in the dark, some whispering prayers, others sobbing softly into their blankets. The storm outside seemed gentler than the one inside them. In the morning the sky cleared and the air smelled like wet earth. A guard passed by, humming a tune. His boots left perfect prints in the mud. The nurse followed the rhythm with her eyes and thought of the letters traveling across the sea, thin paper bridges connecting two worlds that no longer understood each other. Somewhere in Japan, a child would touch that paper and whisper, "She is alive." Somewhere else, an officer would slam his fist on a table and curse the softness that had slipped through the cracks of war. As the days went on, the atmosphere in the camp changed. The women still lined up for meals and counted steps at roll call, but something invisible had shifted. The fear that once held their bodies rigid had begun to loosen. Laughter appeared in quiet corners. Guards and prisoners exchanged nods that bordered on recognition. It was dangerous, that kind of familiarity. It suggested a world without sides. The nurse began helping in the infirmary, cleaning bandages and handing out water. Once, a guard cut his palm on a tin lid. Instinct took over before thought could stop her. She took his hand, wrapped it in cloth, and said the only English word she knew. "Okay." He blinked, surprised, then smiled and nodded. "Okay," he repeated. The word bridged something that neither of them had permission to build. At night, she dreamt of her letter. She imagined it still flying over the sea, caught between storms, refusing to burn. She wondered what the Empire would do when they learned how their prisoners were treated. Perhaps they would deny it. Perhaps they already had. But truth, once written, had a way of surviving. Even if censored, even if torn, the message would remain. The enemy had shown them mercy. One evening, as the sky turned the color of cooling steel, the harmonica played again near the guardhouse. The song was different this time, slower, sadder, almost a farewell. The nurse listened from her bunk and thought of the letters she had never dared to send before. They were more than messages. They were seeds. And somewhere, on another shore, they were already taking root. She lay back, eyes open to the dark rafters above. The wind carried the faint scent of bacon from the kitchen. She smiled despite herself. The smell had once meant danger. Now it meant survival. Autumn slipped quietly into the camp, softening the edges of everything. The air grew cooler, the evenings longer, and the prairie grass turned the color of dusted gold. The nurse noticed the change first in the light. It came slower now, filtered through clouds that stretched thin and silver across the sky. The women had been in Camp Wayride for months, but time here did not behave like time anywhere else. It did not march, it lingered, it folded in on itself like pages reread too many times. The war outside was ending, though none of them had heard the official words yet. Rumors drifted through the barbed wire like ghosts. Japan had surrendered, the emperor had spoken, the cities had burned until there was nothing left to burn. The nurse didn't know what to believe. The guards spoke in low voices, softer than before, and some of them no longer wore helmets. Once she saw one kneeling to feed a stray dog that had wandered near the fence. The sight unsettled her. It was easier to survive when the world stayed cruel. Kindness confused the bones. Every morning still began with the bell. The smell of bacon and coffee rolled through the barracks, dragging the women awake. At first, it had been a comfort. Now it was something heavier, almost suffocating. They had learned to live in captivity, but they had not learned to forgive themselves for surviving it. Hunger had been a constant companion during the war. It had given them purpose. Now, full stomachs brought only questions. How could they eat when the children in Osaka searched through rubble for scraps? How could they sleep on clean sheets when their families might be sleeping under open skies? The contradictions built up like storm clouds. One woman refused breakfast for 3 days. Another threw away her chocolate ration in disgust. The nurse tried to reason with them, but her own words rang hollow. She too felt the ache of guilt gnawing in her chest. When she brushed her hair and saw color returning to her cheeks, she wanted to cry. In the cracked mirror above the sink, she barely recognized the reflection. The woman staring back looked alive, and that felt wrong. Then the parcels came. Red Cross deliveries wrapped neatly in brown paper, stacked at the door like gifts from another world. Each woman's name had been written on a card in English letters. The nurse's heart thudded when she saw hers, the letters shaky but legible. Inside the box lay a bar of soap, a toothbrush, toothpaste, and a small rectangle of chocolate wrapped in silver foil. She touched each item with trembling fingers. They glowed in the light like holy relics. Someone whispered that it might be poison. Another laughed through tears and said, "Then at least it will taste clean." The nurse unwrapped the toothpaste first. The smell of mint hit her nose, sharp and clean. She had forgotten that scent existed. She brushed until her gums bled, staring at the white foam in the basin. When she was done, she sat on her bunk and cried into her hands. The taste of purity felt unbearable. That night, the camp was silent. Even the guitar near the guardhouse stayed still. Mercy had weight, and it pressed on every chest like a stone. In the days that followed, the nurse began to notice small signs of fracture. Some women prayed again, not for victory but for forgiveness. Others sat alone for hours, staring at the fence, lost in private reckonings. The Empire had taught them that honor was measured in suffering, that capture was shame, that death was preferable to mercy. Now they were forced to live with the proof that none of it was true. It was not cruelty that had unmade them, it was compassion. One morning she found the woman who had refused to eat sitting outside the barracks with her empty red crossbox. Her cheeks were wet, her hands shaking. "They gave me chocolate," she said softly. "I ate it. It was sweet. I couldn't finish it." Then she laughed, a sound caught between relief and grief. The nurse sat beside her, unsure what to say. Around them, the camp continued its rhythm. Guards talking, birds calling from the fence posts, the smell of breakfast curling through the air. Life went on, indifferent to their confusion. The nurse began keeping a small notebook, writing in both Japanese and broken English. She wrote about the meals, the weather, the laughter that crept back in spite of guilt. But beneath the words was something else, a record of transformation she did not yet understand. Each night, she reread the entries and felt her heart ache in new ways. Survival had become a kind of education. It taught her that peace could be painful, that kindness could cut deeper than cruelty. By the time the second barbecue came, the shock had worn off. The women lined up without hesitation, though none would admit they looked forward to it. The food was the same, meat sizzling on iron, sweet tea sweating in glass jars. Yet the feeling was different. The fear had faded, replaced by something softer, almost human. The nurse noticed it in the small gestures. A smile passed without shame, a joke whispered in the native tongue, a soldier offering a napkin to a woman who had spilled her drink. They were still captives, but captivity had lost its sting. That night, the nurse sat by her window, the scent of smoke clinging to her hair. She thought about home, if it still existed, if her mother still lived, if her brother had survived. The war had stolen so much that the thought of return felt like stepping into an empty house. But here, in this strange American village fenced with wire and guarded by boys, she had discovered something she couldn't name. It was not peace, not happiness, but a fragile kind of balance. The body healed first, the heart would follow if it dared. She lay down, listening to the crickets and the far-off strum of a guitar. The stars outside were brighter than any she had seen in Japan, cold and endless. The morning began like any other, sunlight climbing slowly over the horizon, the air still cool, the faint scent of frying bacon weaving through the camp. But something was wrong. There was no laughter near the kitchen, no music from the guardhouse, no echo of boots on gravel. When the nurse stepped outside, she felt it immediately, a stillness that tasted like ending. The notice board near the mess hall was surrounded by a small crowd. She walked closer, heart already tightening before her eyes found the words, "Repatriation orders confirmed. Transport to begin within the week." For a moment, no one spoke. Then a single sob broke the quiet. It wasn't joy or sorrow, but something stranger, heavier. The war was over. The letters had been right. Japan had surrendered months ago, and now the time had come to return home. The nurse felt her knees weaken. Home, the word had lost meaning. What waited for them there? Cities reduced to ash, families buried under rubble, streets where even shadows had burned away. They had dreamt of freedom, but the thought of it now made their stomachs twist. In the following days, the camp moved like a body preparing for sleep. Boxes were packed, clothes folded, bunk beds stripped. The nurse's hands worked automatically, but her mind drifted. Every corner of Camp Wainwright seemed alive with memory. The showers where she had wept, the mess hall where laughter had returned, the field where smoke had once drifted like perfume. The guards were quieter, more formal again, as if unsure what role they were supposed to play in this final act. The nurse folded her few belongings into a Red Cross bag, 2 plain dresses, her comb, a towel, the notebook she had kept since her first night. Then she paused. On the small wooden shelf beside her bunk sat the nearly empty glass bottle of barbecue sauce. She had traded for it months ago with a woman who couldn't bear its smell. The nurse hesitated, then tucked it gently between her clothes. She didn't know. Why? Maybe it was a charm. Maybe it was proof that kindness had been real. The last cookout came 2 nights before departure. It was smaller than the others, quieter, more like a farewell than a celebration. The Cowboys came again, their hats tilted low, their laughter softer. The women lined up, not with fear, but with the fragile grace of people learning to let go. Smoke curled through the twilight. The nurse took her place near the edge of the table, watching the fire flicker in the wind. The food tasted the same. Grilled beef, cornbread, sweet tea, yet everything felt changed. A guard she recognized approached with a tray of plates. His face was sunburned, his expression uncertain. He handed her one with both hands, an unspoken gesture of respect. "You'll be leaving soon," he said through the translator. "The train comes Thursday." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He hesitated, then smiled. "You'll see your home again." The words hit her like a wound. Home, she wanted to believe it. But what if there was nothing left to return to? As dusk settled, a guard began to play the harmonica. The tune drifted across the camp like smoke from the fire. Slow, mournful, beautiful. The women listened in silence. Some began to cry. One woman whispered that she had dreamed of this sound in captivity and thought it was a sign from the dead. The nurse closed her eyes and let the melody wash through her. Every note felt like a goodbye wrapped in mercy. When the meal ended, the guards lingered. There were no speeches, no orders. One man pressed a small harmonica into a woman's hand. "For the quiet nights," he said. Another handed a folded letter to the translator, asking it be carried to Japan if possible. The nurse didn't expect anything, yet when the young guard who often played guitar approached her, she stood automatically. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. 2 people who should have been enemies, bound together by shared silence. "I don't know how to say bye in English," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "That'll do." The next morning, the buses waited by the gate. The women carried their few possessions, their steps slow, deliberate. The nurse clutched her Red Cross bag tightly against her chest. The air smelled faintly of ashes from last night's fire. When she reached the gate, she turned once more toward the camp. The guards stood lined along the fence, hats in their hands. No one saluted. No one waved. It was better that way. Words would have ruined what silence had already said. The bus rumbled down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust behind. The nurse looked out the window. The camp grew smaller, then disappeared entirely. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, open, blue, merciless. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small bottle of sauce. The glass caught the light. She turned it over in her hands, remembering the day she had first tasted it, the shock of flavor, the laughter that followed. It wasn't the sauce she was carrying. It was proof. Proof that goodness could survive war. Proof that humanity could bloom even in captivity. The convoy stopped once near a wide field of sunflowers. The nurse stepped out, breathing in the scent of earth and distance. She felt a sudden urge to drop the bottle, to leave it here where mercy had found her. But she couldn't. Some memories she knew were meant to be carried. That night, on the transport ship bound for Japan, she sat on the deck and stared at the dark water stretching toward home. The stars above were as bright as they had been in Texas, but colder. The wind carried the smell of salt, not smoke. She closed her eyes and saw the camp again. The tables, the laughter, the firelight on faces once hardened by fear. She thought of the guards, of the boy with the guitar, of Natsuko turning meat on the grill. For the first time she whispered their names in prayer. When dawn came, she could see land, faint, grey, ghost-like, home. The word still felt on her tongue. The nurse pressed the bottle of sauce to her chest and whispered, I will remember. The waves broke softly against the ship, and for the first time since her capture, she smiled without guilt. The war was over, but something far greater had survived, the quiet, stubborn truth that kindness could outlive even destruction. As the ship entered the harbor, the rising sun burned through the fog. The light caught the surface of the sea, turning it red and gold. The nurse whispered one final thought into the wind, a prayer meant for both sides of the ocean. May the next fire feed peace, not hunger. Spring came late that year. In a small village outside Kyoto, the air carried the faint smell of charcoal and blooming petals. Beneath a cherry blossom tree sat an old woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her hands, still steady despite the years, turned thin slices of pork over a tiny charcoal grill. Smoke drifted upward, soft and white, curling through the branches heavy with pink flowers. The woman's granddaughter sat nearby, knees tucked to her chest, watching with quiet curiosity. "Grandmother?" the girl asked. "Why do you always cook over fire when we have a stove?" The old woman smiled faintly, eyes never leaving the coals. "Because it tastes better this way," she said. After a pause, she added, "And because that's how the Cowboys did it." The child blinked in confusion. "Cowboys?" she repeated, the word foreign and strange in her mouth. The old woman didn't answer right away. She turned another piece of meat, the fat sizzling as it met the flame. The smoke rose, carrying with it ghosts of another time. "Yes," she said finally, her voice low. "Cowboys." The word hung between them like a secret. She could see it all as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The endless Texas sky, the heat shimmering above the wire fences, the laughter of men who had once been called enemies. She remembered the smell of the fire that had fed her when the rest of the world had forgotten she existed. She remembered the sound of a guitar at dusk, the kindness in a soldier's eyes, and the moment she realized that mercy could come from the most unlikely hands. The granddaughter watched her silently, waiting for more, but the old woman said nothing else. She had learned long ago that some stories were not meant to be told in full. They lived better in gestures, in the way you salted a soup, in the way you turned meat with patience, in the way smoke clung to your clothes as if it refused to let go of memory. After the war, she had returned to Japan with nothing but a red cross bag and a bottle of American barbecue sauce. The bottle still sat in a drawer in her home, the label faded, the glass clouded with time. She never used it, but she could not throw it away. It was proof that the world was not made entirely of cruelty. Proof that even in captivity she had tasted something like freedom. Her children had grown up hearing only fragments. When they asked about the camp, she would smile and say, "We survived, nothing more." She never told them about the cookouts, the laughter, the guilt that came with being treated gently by the enemy. She never spoke of the nights she cried quietly into her pillow, torn between shame and gratitude. Those memories belonged to another life, one that could not be explained without reopening wounds. The girl leaned forward, sniffing the air. "It smells good," she said, "like when the neighbors burn wood after the rain." The old woman nodded. "Yes, smoke remembers." The grill hissed softly. A petal drifted down and landed on the meat. The old woman brushed it away with the edge of her chopsticks, her hand trembling only slightly. For a brief moment, she was back in Texas, sitting at a long table under a sky too wide to comprehend, listening to voices that no longer sounded like strangers. She remembered the young guard who had given her his cup of tea, the school teacher who had dared to help at the grill, the quiet harmonica that had played them all to sleep. When she opened her eyes again, she was back under the blossoms. The years between then and now felt like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to forget. She placed the cooked meat on a small plate and handed it to her granddaughter. "Eat," she said softly, "and remember that kindness is also a kind of fire. It burns, but it feeds too." The girl took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. "It's sweet," she said, "like the sauce you keep in the drawer." The old woman smiled but said nothing. She looked up at the blossoms above her, their petals drifting, like snow, and thought of the women who had stood beside her in the camp, some gone, some scattered, all changed by what they had seen. She wondered if they too still dreamed of the fires, if they too had carried the scent of smoke across the ocean. The wind shifted, carrying a trace of charcoal through the garden. The old woman closed her eyes. She could almost hear the harmonica again, soft and distant, playing the same melody that had once floated over barbed wire under a Texan sunset. "Grandmother," the girl whispered, "were you ever afraid?" The woman opened her eyes and smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "but fear ends when you learn to see people instead of enemies." The girl nodded, not fully understanding, and went back to eating. The old woman turned the last slice of pork, watching the edges brown. The smoke rose higher now, curling into the bright blue sky until it vanished. She imagined it crossing the ocean, drifting over forgotten fields in Texas, over rusted fences swallowed by grass, over the ghosts of a camp that no longer existed. When the last petal fell and the coals turned to ash, she whispered one final thought into the air. "We were prisoners," she said softly, "but they fed us like neighbors." The wind carried the words away, scattering them like blossoms across the yard. The girl didn't hear them, but one day she would remember the smell of that fire and wonder what it meant. And in that wondering, the story would live again, not in history books or monuments, but in the gentle act of feeding another human being.